Remember back in part 1 of the Nixon shock where you said whoever has the gold makes the rules?
I do. Yes.
You still think that's true?
I think so, but I think we're migrating away from whoever has the gold to whoever has the dollars in this episode, aren't we?
Seems like it. Seems
Maybe.
like it.
All right, let's go. Yep.
Let's do it. Ladies and gentlemen, the president has reached 4 firm decisions. They're real simple, so let me spell them out. We're not setting up any wage price review board. Too much talk, not enough action. We're not imposing mandatory wage or price controls. Markets will work if we give them breathing room. We're not going to jack up federal spending. This administration means to live within its means. And we're not cutting taxes right now. First we lick inflation, then we talk relief. The cure is steady discipline. No quick fixes, no gimmicks. Stick with us, and we'll whip this inflation yet.
Very well done.
That's John Connally's famous 4 no's speech after he is elected Secretary of the Treasury. All right, so we're picking up here in 1970. It's the first Nixon administration, and we have the first showings of stagflation, where prices are rising and growth is shrinking. One quote from Arthur Burns later says that the economy doesn't work the way that it used to work, right? Because this was not possible under current economic thinking. And the Nixon administration's response to this first showing of stagflation is what was called gradualism, which is basically modest fiscal and monetary restraint to cool demand, to bring prices down, and make it moderate so that we avoid a recession.
So fiscal monetary restraint, basically low interest rates, but not really low, and cut spending, but not super fast.
Exactly.
Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, and I think important to keep in mind during this time is there were a bunch of equations behind all this stuff during this time, right? People thought that they had kind of figured out the economy and that they knew the exact right interest rate and the exact right amount of fiscal spending to get a GDP number, right? It was kind of that. There was an equation behind these things.
Yeah. Makes me think of Harry White thinking about central planning and moving to Russia.
It was very, very Harry White, yes. And so in 1970, it started to become clear that gradualism was too gradual, right? Nixon had lost Congress in the 1970 election. Unemployment was at post-World War II highs, and inflation was still 4.5%. And we actually were in a recession for most of the year of 1970. And so things are not going well for Tricky Dick here. You got to remember, this is a guy who he lost the presidential election in 1960. He actually immediately went and lost the senator race in California right after that. I didn't appreciate that.
The governor's race, right?
Sorry, the governor's race, yeah.
Yeah.
And then in 1968, he barely wins. So he does not have sort of a majority of the country, rooting for him or anything like that. And then in 1970, he loses Congress, again to the same economic issue that he lost the presidential election to in 1960.
It seems like he's pretty well traumatized about all this. The numbers that I saw was that the Republicans lost 12 seats in the House and 11 governorships, which seems like a pretty massive loss on a midterm election.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a nightmare for him. He's in the year of the congressional election is just a full-on recession the whole year.
Yeah, and he's already paranoid from what you said, all these other losses in his past, right?
Right. And in addition to the sort of bad domestic situation, you're starting to hear whispers of a global monetary crisis. U.S. gold is down to $10 billion. Several countries are demanding to exchange their dollars for gold. U.S. dollars are just flying out of the country to get into other currencies because people are starting to expect, some major change. And the stock markets are pretty lethargic. And so Nixon is seething over this, right? Like he's kind of like, oh my gosh, like this economic issue, like we got to get on top of this issue. He'd already lost all these elections over this issue, and the world's kind of telling him it's time for a bold move, right? You look at the markets and you look what people are talking about, and the world's kind of expecting this bold move. Nixon had already kind of made these kind of bold moves in the foreign policy arena, right? And that's what he really cared about, right? Like he really cared about what is called triangular diplomacy. He really cared about uh, de-escalation with Russia and opening up with China. And that was that. He had this thing called the Nixon Doctrine when it came to foreign policy, which can really be summarized as burden sharing, right? Where he was expecting, foreign countries to start to share more of the burden that the U.S. had been bearing since World War II. And it starts to become clear that part of the economic response to this potential dollar crisis is bringing the Nixon Doctrine into the economic realm and starting to change things so that everything's not weighing on the U.S. anymore. In order to do that, he's going to have to make some really, really bold moves, some really, really big changes. He's already got his man at the Fed. Arthur Burns is there and he's in place. And now he needs his guy running the Treasury. And this is where we meet John Connally Jr.
One of the things that I found really interesting is actually how Arthur Burns makes it into the Fed. And it's going to have, I think, some read-throughs into how Connally comes into Treasury. But Martin historically, had been 2 decades Fed chairman, right? Like we talked about in the last episode. And towards the end of his tenure, Nixon doesn't fire him, but effectively tells him, once your term is up, your 14-year term as a governor of the Fed, I'm not going to renew it, and I'm going to nominate Arthur Burns. And there's a funny story actually in a completely separate book called The Man Who Knew about Alan Greenspan, where there's a whole scene that describes that exchange. And the whole exchange with Arthur Burns and Nixon is that Nixon basically tells him that he expects him to be his man at the Fed and to support the policies of the White House. And you're starting to kind of see this toying with Fed independence that is not only a big issue now, but was a really big issue then.
Yes, and you got some major Fed bashing when it comes to the Burns Nixon relationship that we'll get into as we get closer.
I thought you were going to say Trump Powell, but yeah,
it definitely sounds a lot like what's going on today.
Yeah.
All right, so Richard Nixon replaces the Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy, with this guy who's got no economics or finance training, John Connally Jr. It's significant, I think, because David Kennedy kind of it almost seems like he was kind of like the perfect Secretary of the Treasury, right? Like he understood economics. He was very well regarded. He's very conservative. He's the kind of person that Nixon wanted in that role when he started. But now we're moving into a time where we need somebody bold. We need somebody who's known for making big moves. And so Nixon brings in John Connally Jr., who's just this fascinating character, right? So John Connally Jr. grew up in East Texas. He went to UT Law School, and this guy was LBJ's like right-hand man from everything that I can tell, right? Like he was with him through LBJ's presidential time. One thing that's really significant that listeners are probably picking up on, right, is that this guy was a Democrat, right? And Richard Nixon is one of the most famous conservatives ever. And so Connally's a Democrat, and it's worth pausing to talk about kind of what was going on in Texas during this time.
Yeah,
right?
Texas and the whole South, right?
Right. And so there was this sort of, I guess, new political group called the Dixiecrats, right? So a lot of the Southern Democrats are splitting from the Democratic Party primarily over civil rights issues, and are kind of up for grabs in a sense, right? In terms of, are they going to vote for a Republican president or a Democratic president in the next election? And this is right down the middle for Nixon, right? Because Nixon's main sort of domestic strategy is something called building the new majority, where he's trying to take all the people in the middle and get them to vote for Richard Nixon in 1972. And so a lot of the reason that Nixon wanted to bring in Connally, along with a bunch of other reasons that we'll talk about, is that he was a leader of the Dixiecrat group. And Nixon felt that by bringing John Connally into the administration, he had a better chance at getting the Dixiecrat vote in 1970 congressional election and 1972 presidential election. And so this guy, John Connally, he's coming in as Secretary of Treasury. He already, my take is he's already kind of a legend for a couple reasons. One is that John Connally was in the car with JFK and actually took bullets when JFK was assassinated, right? And so he's got this sort of historical weight about him, right? The question of, JFK died, but this guy, John Connally, is still alive. And to add on to this mystique, right, you also had this gigantic personality, right? This is the kind of guy, he's very charismatic. He's a master coalition builder. He's, from what I can tell, this guy kind of defined swagger, right? Like he kind of owned any room that he came into. And this played out in politics, right? So he's the governor of Texas through the 60s, which is sort of a fractious state at this point, right? Because of the Dixiecrat break. But he's getting over 70% of the votes in
Yeah,
Texas
massive.
during this time, which is wild. So people love this guy, and so he's coming in as Secretary of Treasury. He is, from what I can tell, the first person in modern times to be Secretary of Treasury with no economics background whatsoever, right? But super articulate, super quick study. Did you happen to come across who he was mostly going to kind of ask questions and learn from when you were studying for this session?
Ooh, I remember there was a story about this that he picked it up really quickly. He was a great understudy, but I don't remember who it was. Was it Paul Volcker?
Bill McChesney Martin.
Oh, no kidding. Our
Yeah.
protagonist from part 2.
Another feather
Love
in
that
Bill
guy.
McChesney Martin's hat. Yeah, that guy seems like he was just a great dude.
He's a true legend, yeah.
Yep. And then two more things to know about this sort of fascinating character of John Connally Jr. One is that when it comes to global issues, John Connally is just the definition of nationalist, right? He's U.S. first on everything, which is an interesting dynamic in the Nixon administration, right? Because Nixon's opening up China and he's dealing with Russia. And, Nixon was arguably a kind of a foreign policy first president. And that's kind of where he was trying to make his mark. And all this domestic stuff was just kind of in the way for him.
And famously, he has Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State, right? Probably the most legendary, or at least the most famous Secretary of State of all time for the U.S.
Right. And so, like, for example, as we kind of get into more complex issues around the global economy, we're going to find John Connally saying things like, I just want to screw the foreigners before they screw us. And sort of, it was that simple for him when it comes to economic policy. And then a final point for me on who this guy was, right? There was a very real chance that this guy was going to be Nixon's running mate in 1972 as VP, which is fascinating to consider, right? Because there hadn't been a split ticket Republican Democrat run at the president since it was the rule, right?
Yeah.
Because like back in the day, the second place loser was the vice president. There hadn't been a vice president that was not the party of the president since way back in those days.
The vice president at this time is the guy that nobody will ever remember because he didn't do much, Spiro Agnew, and whose name is actually kind of hard to remember anyway. And that's part of the reason why. I think if I remember correctly, Nixon chose him because he didn't want to be upstaged by his VP candidate, which is, I guess, fairly common for political operatives. But that wasn't the case going into 1972. So I think Connally had a real good chance of being his VP running mate.
Absolutely. And not only that, but there were talks of Connally for president in 76, right? And so this guy is a super interesting background and also hyper ambitious, right? He has his eyes on VP in 72. He has his eyes on running for president in 76. And now he's kind of coming in to prove that he can play with the big boys, I think, is a little bit of what's going on here, right? He's got no economics background. He's probably viewed as a little bit of a Texan, not going to fit in DC kind of thing.
Yeah, an outsider. You know what's really interesting to me about him is how he was already on Nixon's radar, but he really gets on his radar as a potential cabinet member as a part of what was called the Ash Council, which was Doge before Doge, because the whole point of this council that Nixon set up was to suggest efficiencies in the government. Basically, where in the government can we cut costs or bureaucratic burden? And John Connally was one of the principals leading the research on that group. And during one of the debriefings with Nixon, the council is basically reporting on its insights, and Nixon is not interested. He wants no part of this meeting, and he's bored. And apparently Connally, being very aware, he notices that and jumps in, takes over the meeting, summarizes everything really concisely, simply, in a very engaging, sort of charismatic John Connally kind of way. And Nixon re-engages in the meeting, makes some decisions, and they end the meeting. And Nixon walks out of that meeting thinking, like, again, Connally was already in his radar, but he's thinking, I want that guy on my team. Like, I want that guy to play for me every day.
Absolutely. And I came away from learning about John Connally in more depth and just really liking the guy, right? He really did seem like kind of the right guy at the right time. And so, as we move towards this historic break, right? How did we get there? So the first catalyst, right, was this is just straight up the loss of the 1970 congressional election due to the economic issue, right? Summarized by stagflation, summarized by an almost full year recession. We bring in John Connally, and now Richard Nixon has his guys at the Fed and at the Treasury. But the saying at the time, right, was that this economic policy of gradualism was too gradual, right? It was not making changes fast enough. And as we get into mid sort of 71, right, billions of dollars a day are fleeing the U.S. trying to get into other currencies. Germany has actually already floated its currency in response to these trends, and when they floated their currency, it appreciated 10% against the dollar very quickly, which is a huge move in the currency markets. These are supposed to be stable currencies that don't move around much.
Yeah, and they were doing this through the IMF, right? I mean, basically what was happening is that their economy was growing really fast. It was attracting a ton of capital. The mechanism through which you did this in Bretton Woods is you go to the IMF, you said, hey, there's a big imbalance here. We need to fix it. We need to revalue our currency. And they were kind of going through these motions, and that's part of why they floated. But I think the reaction of the market and the fact that capital flows, private capital flows had grown so big was much bigger than anybody expected. And I think people were really worried about destabilization in the system, right, with West Germany.
Absolutely. I think people were terrified at this point, right? You had key countries asking for all their gold back. Right before, in mid 71, a French missile cruiser comes into the New York harbor to collect its gold from the New York
Very
Fed.
subtle. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of wild stuff. Can you imagine being kind of looking out into the Hudson and seeing a French battleship, there to collect its gold? And the driver of this, right, is that the U.S. came out of World War II with all the gold, and at this point in mid 71, just the U.S. dollars held by central banks outweighed U.S. gold by about 5 times. This is not including all the other dollars that are out there. This is just the dollars that are sitting in central bank vaults outweighed the U.S. dollar at least 5 to 1. And so everybody's looking at this promise to convert to gold and saying, there's no way this is gonna work out. And then my view is that the thing that really, really caused the panic was that the U.S. had its first goods deficit since 1893, right? And there was this view that this is what is going to create a real global monetary crisis. This is sort of the last straw for global markets, that the U.S., who has clearly been this major goods surplus country since 1893, is now, people are fleeing its currency. Governments want their gold, and now they're in a trade deficit, with the rest of the world.
Well, it's worth highlighting the fact that we talked a lot in part 2 about how there were massive trade deficits in the U.S., but you got to remember those trade deficits were driven largely by foreign aid and troops in Europe and capital flows, right? People taking capital from the U.S. and investing it abroad because they could get better returns in Europe or Japan as those economies were recovering from World War II. This is fundamentally different because throughout that whole period, the U.S. was still in massive surplus in terms of their merchandise trade and the goods trade. They were still producing a ton of goods that the world was buying. And that was, in a sense, floating everything else, all the other deficits. The key shift here is that by the late 60s, by like 1969 through 1971, that changes. And now the U.S. is also in a goods deficit. And so they're importing more than they're exporting on goods, independent on, of military spending abroad or even capital flows, which is huge. It's a big deal. And you said since the first time since 1893, which coincidentally, throwback, was when Bill Martin's grandpa lost his grain storage business.
There you go.
To the panic.
So this is really all about Bill Martin. Everything about economics.
It's the through line of economic history.
The point here is that it's become like you're not just getting a run on a local bank or a regional bank, right? You're getting a run on the very core of the global monetary system, which is the US dollar, right? It's not gold. The core of the global monetary system is the US dollar. And people at this point, mid-1971, want nothing to do with the US dollar.
Yeah.
And so bold action is needed. In the midst of this sort of economic chaos, you have Connally at the Treasury, Burns at the Fed, McCracken at the Council of Economic Advisors, and others that are out in the press saying all kinds of diverging things. Burns at this time, he's famous for saying economics doesn't work the way it used to, right? That's a direct reference to stagflation, right? The economics, it's not supposed to be possible that you have rising prices and falling growth and rising unemployment. And then we also got sort of historic Fed bashing in this mid 1971 period, right? There was talk of things like putting a bunch more Fed governors in the FOMC to sort of water out Burns. There was a rumor spread that Burns had asked for a raise in the midst of calling for wage and price controls.
Yeah, which is funny, Matt, right? Because we said at the top that Burns was put into Fed chairmanship because he was Nixon's guy. And what's interesting is that when he gets into the Fed, he doesn't immediately acquiesce to everything that Nixon and the White House want. I mean, that comes later a bit, but for now, he's holding onto Fed independence and trying to do what's right for the economy, not for Nixon politically, which is why he's getting killed by Nixon in the press.
Right, and one interesting reading in this time period is Arthur Burns actually had a personal journal that got published. And when you read the journal, I actually didn't come away from the journal thinking that this was a Nixon puppet. I don't think that he thought he was a Nixon puppet, at least.
Yeah.
That's how he framed himself in his personal journal.
Yeah. Although, like in terms of at least his legacy, most people, in contrast to Bill Martin, think of Burns as probably one of the worst Fed chairmen of all time because of what happens later. But
right. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. But the point here is that this is a really important moment for John Connally, right? You have all these leaders out in the press saying all these different things, and Nixon gets everybody together and he says Connally is the economic spokesman for this administration, and John Connally is going to develop a comprehensive plan in response to the global crisis, right? And so we come to a head here where John Connally is kind of put in charge.
And he's only been in his seat for 3 months at this point, 6 months, because he comes in effectively at the beginning of 1971, right? So by the time Nixon proclaims this, he's only been there for a couple of months. I mean, talk about pressure.
Right. But I think, my guy, John Connally, I think he could handle it,
He can handle it, baby.
Seems like he is the kind of guy who loved it kind of thing.
Yeah.
Especially keep in mind, right? This guy has bigger aspirations, right? He's looking at VP in 72 and president in 76. And so he's probably there. He's certainly nervous, right? He's got to prove himself, but he's got guys like Bill McChesney Martin on speed dial for questions that he's asking.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about him, just as a personality too, is that he is very similar to our two main guys from Part 1, Harry White and John Maynard Keynes, in the sense that he has a big ego, and he also has this really strong desire, this drive to be relevant and to be the guy in the room making decisions, to be a leader and to leave a legacy. And in a way that plays to his strengths with what is about to happen and everything that Nixon is putting on him, because he has a really strong amount of self-assurance. He's going to go do it. He's going to go tackle it.
And so this story of the Nixon shock, it really all comes to a head at Camp David, right? So Camp David is this presidential retreat. It's about a 30-minute helicopter ride from the White House in Maryland. And on this weekend in 1971, Nixon calls a very select group to come and make this bold move, right? So he's got Schultz, Burns from the Fed, and Schultz at this point is, I believe, still head of the Office of Management and Budget, right?
Right. And funny thing about Schultz is Nixon deliberately tells him when he invites him, or maybe this is maybe a couple of weeks before when they're sharing the plan. Nixon tells Connally, when you brief Schultz, make sure to tell him not to talk to Milton Friedman, because they knew that all these policies that they were thinking about were anathema to Milton Friedman, and he would probably go public with opposition, which I thought was kind of funny.
Schultz goes on from here to have a lot more happen for him. He's a very interesting, impactful guy just throughout U.S. history. But you had Schultz, you had head of the Fed Arthur Burns, you had Paul Volcker. So Paul Volcker is going to be featured in pretty much every episode from 1960 to like 1990. This guy seemed like he was always there. Interestingly, right, when Nixon appoints Connally to develop a comprehensive plan, Volcker had already done that, right? So Volcker had spent the last 2 years developing a plan, and a lot of what Connally ends up grabbing onto is Volcker's plan. From there's some stuff changed, but a lot of it is the plan that Volcker had been making. Essentially, in the case of a global monetary emergency, Volcker had this plan that he had made.
And as opposed to Connally too, Volcker is an economist. I mean, this guy had a graduate degree in economics, I think from Harvard, if I remember right. He is as expert as anybody on macroeconomics and the global economy. And interestingly, he also spent time in Democratic administrations, right? So he's also similar to Connally in that he's now working for a Republican.
Yep. He's also huge. He's
massive. He's a basketball player.
I think.
Yeah.
And he's 6'8", and as we get into the Camp David story, he's wearing this white summer suit, which feels like the wrong thing to wear.
Totally wrong. And also, there's also an anecdote out there that apparently Connally at some point at the Treasury runs into him and he's wearing this disheveled old suit that doesn't quite fit him, and he like threatens to fire him. Now, I don't know if that was half joking, but you mentioned Connally was like a very well-dressed guy who likes to look good in public, and he tells Volcker to get it together or you're fired. Like, we can't be seen dressing like that, especially Volcker, who stands out in any room he's in. 6'8".
And Volcker and Connally they got along really well though. Otherwise, right? That's kind of
I think so.
They were pretty much on the same team. My guess is that to your answer earlier on who taught Connally, my guess is Volcker was very much in the mix there as well.
Yeah.
You had so at Camp David, you had Schultz, Burns, Volcker. You had McCracken, who's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, which is just has a major voice in the conversation. You also had Herb Stein at Camp David, who was a prominent economist at the time, and he's Ben Stein's dad, which I think Ben Stein ended up being quite famous on a number of TV shows. And if you look up Ben Stein, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I know that guy. Then you had Connally and you had Nixon. So two things stood out to me about this group. One is that you had nobody from the foreign policy community there, which I think is very interesting because that was kind of Nixon's thing, right? So maybe Nixon thought he was the foreign policy guy in the room.
Mm-hmm. Well, they deliberately excluded them, right?
Right. No, my understanding is that the Secretary of State at the time actually found out about the event, asked for an invitation, and was rejected.
Oh, really?
And it wasn't Kissinger at this point. Kissinger came a little later as Secretary of State.
Kissinger was like National Security Advisor or something like that at this point, right?
Right. So that's interesting, given that what we're talking about has a lot of foreign policy implications. But given that Connally's in charge, right? Back to Connally, this is really Connally's in charge, right? He's a nationalist, so he does not really care what somebody like Kissinger has to say. All he cares about is how it's going to affect the U.S. And then the second thing that stood out to me is this is a pretty young crowd, right? I think Burns is in his mid-60s, but otherwise the average age here is 46. So you actually have a pretty young group of people in the room. And so they get into their conversation, but the reality is that the decision's already been made. John Connally has drafted his plan. and he's in charge. And interestingly, he has a story to tell that ends up not being true, right? So at this point, the U.S. has $10 billion of gold in its vaults in Fort Knox. We kind of walked through the pieces of the global monetary crisis earlier. Connally comes to Camp David and he says, guys, the UK just asked that we send them $3 billion in gold, right? They want to exchange their 3 billion US dollars for $3 billion in gold. That's 30% of all of our gold. And so, we need to do something huge here, right? We cannot do something incremental. We can't, announce policies in a staged way. We need to come out big here. We need to shock the world. And from everything I can tell, that story was not true, and he knew it was not true.
Oh, I didn't know he knew. I knew that it wasn't true in the sense that there were, the British actually didn't want to redeem all this gold, and it was a miscommunication. But I didn't know John Connally knew that.
So Burns came out later and said that that was not true.
Interesting.
And everything that I read said, just given Connally was good at his job, right? This was not a dumb guy.
Well, it tracks. It tracks with his personality. This is totally something John Connally would do.
Right. And so he's good at his job, and so to say something like that at a conference like this and have it be bad, have it be wrong, right? Like that's not really his thing, right? His thing is audacious negotiations and big statements and getting his way. And so like there's no way that the Secretary of the Treasury is showing up at Camp David with this information and it's just wrong, right? Like he had firsthand knowledge of the information.
Yeah, interesting.
But so this kind of talk, right, really impacts the outcomes. And there's a lot of back and forth about, should we do this? Should we do that? Should we do it after the election? Should we do it before the election? Should we call in some of our global counterparts and do this together? And John Connally is just sitting in the middle. And he's saying, nope, we're doing this the Texas way. We're doing this my way. We're going big. We're going big this weekend. And that's it. Right?
Yeah, and John Connally, too, knows who he's playing. Like, he knows his audience, right? And that's Richard Nixon, who eats this stuff up. Richard Nixon was in love with bold moves. He wanted to be seen as somebody who could come out swinging and hit it out of the park. He doesn't want to be seen as this guy who just comes in slow and tries to take things safely. He wants to go bold. And John Connally's perfect for this.
Right. And I think a couple times, one of the things John Connally did to kind of play Nixon was he kept comparing this move to the things Nixon was doing internationally, right? He kept saying, you're doing all these great things by opening up China,
all that stuff.
And he's saying, this is your domestic China. Which, he didn't say that exactly, but I think you get the picture, right? He's saying this is your big move for the regular everyday U.S. person. The primary changes made at Camp David are one, the gold window is shut, right? So US dollars are no longer convertible into gold. Second, we get a wage price freeze, right? So one thing that's really important about this time is the economy had a lot more unions in it, right? I think about a quarter of the economy was kind of, the workforce was represented by a union. And the unions were just pushing up their wages like crazy at this time. And so super interestingly, most people supported a wage price freeze, right? And so I think Nixon gets bashed a lot for doing this because he said he would never do it, right? You heard in Connally's kind of opening statement, like, we'll never do this. Also interestingly, they've in wartime, as far as I can tell, wage price freezes have literally never worked. But I think it is important to note that over half of the U.S. wanted this, right? And so to the extent that we live in a democracy and the people we elect are supposed to do what we want.
Yeah, it's a popular policy, despite it being opposed by some pretty prominent economists, I think is the way to frame it, right?
Right. And I think it's because, although 25% of people were in unions, 75% of people were not in unions. And some of these unions were getting like 30% wage increases per year kind of thing. And it was just totally screwing up the economy. And then the third major change was an import surcharge. Sound familiar? Where
sounds like a tariff.
They were going to put a 10% tariff on all goods,
everything,
coming into the U.S. This was meant to be kind of a mix of policies that, both some would be inflationary, some would be deflationary. One super, super important fact here, right, is that none of this was meant to be permanent, right? Like the closing of the gold window, the wage price freezes were explicitly 90 days. The closing of the gold window was really meant to get people to the table, right? To kind of create a pause and get people to the table to where we could renegotiate Bretton Woods currency rates. And the import surcharge was basically the hammer to make that happen, right? It was kind of
Yeah.
like, hey, if you don't come and renegotiate your currency rates with us, then we're gonna put a 10% tariff on you. And until you come and negotiate, then you're not going to be able to get anything into the US markets. So that's kind of the core of what got decided at Camp David. There were some other things, especially in the beginning, that fell away, right? Like Richard Nixon was really big on some sort of budget cut alongside this to show, a modicum of fiscal conservatism. Of course, that falls away by the time that policy, really gets set. And so we have this sort of three-pronged change, and each of these things is huge in its own right, right? You have the closing of the gold window, you have a 90-day wage price freeze, and you have a 10% tariff surcharge on all goods coming into the US. This had all, to be honest, been decided before they showed up at Camp David because this was Connally's call. But by Saturday, right, of this Friday, Saturday, Sunday weekend at Camp David, these things were in place. And now we're all working towards a speech that President Nixon's going to give at some point on Sunday night.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's funny that you say that because there's a quote that I found from Richard Nixon that apparently on his way back to D.C. after they wrap everything up, he's sitting with one of his aides in the helicopter, and one of the things he says, and this is a verbatim quote apparently, he says, when all this was cooked up, Connally and me, we had it set 60 days ago, which I thought was super interesting. But it definitely is the way that it plays out. And if you read Paul Volcker's biography that he wrote, this is kind of what gets talked about. It was a plan that was pretty much in place, and all of the debates at Camp David is more about polishing and getting organized more so than actually putting together the plan. The plan was there. But what's interesting too is that if you then fast forward into Sunday, everybody leaves but Nixon in the morning after breakfast, and he stays behind. And there's another little factoid that I discovered that I also thought was kind of amusing. Apparently, Richard Nixon wants to call this new economic policy. Like, that's what he wants to call this. This is the new economy policy, new economic policy. And he remembers after he decides on this, and before he gives the speech, that this is also what Lenin called his economic program in the early days of the Soviet Union, and decides that it doesn't matter, and he still wants the name, and so he runs with it. But basically,
Nice.
for the next few hours on Sunday, everybody is scrambling to get back to the White House, to get organized, to get, to coordinate with the networks, to get the TV slot ready for the speech that night, and then to prepare all the briefings that they're going to need to talk to the head of the IMF and notify them that this is what they've decided to do, to talk to the heads of states of all of the allies that depend on the dollar, and to prepare for a press briefing ahead of the speech, and then any questions that will come at them immediately after. So it's a bit of a chaotic frenzy to try to organize all of this, because there's only a handful, maybe a dozen people at Camp David, and now they have to communicate to the rest of the White House and the West Wing to coordinate all this in a matter of hours before the speech.
And so the speech from Richard Nixon happens late on Sunday night. Remember, that's one of the really important things here is that these guys feel that it's very important that this get out into the world before the markets open on Monday, specifically because this pretty negative deficit data had come out or was about to come out, and there was fear that like this was gonna cause a full-on dollar panic that they weren't going to be able to rebound from.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
So Nixon gives this speech, and remember, it wasn't that long ago before this that people thought, if we break the Bretton Woods sort of standard, nobody knows what's on the other side of this coin,
Yeah.
right? It's just a total sort of leap off the cliff into the unknown. And to me, one of the really interesting things about the response to Nixon's speech and these super extreme policies, right, all at once, right, not released, one this week, one next week, right, this is all in one speech, is that people loved it, right?
Yep.
You had
Sure
when
did.
the
Well,
market,
local people,
right,
Americans.
US loved it. US
Yes.
loved it.
Yes.
And so you had this massive economic announcement, right? Like there's several quotes about this Camp David weekend saying, this is the biggest economic announcement since Bretton Woods. This is the biggest economic announcement since FDR, all that stuff. And keep in mind that just a couple of months ago, the people that were at Camp David, like mainly Paul Volcker, were thinking that, we have no idea what's on the other side of this, right? Like if we break with gold, there is no monetary system if we
Yeah.
break with gold. Like it's just an unknown what's going to happen. And so they make this big speech on Sunday night, super famous speech. Markets open on Monday, and you get a really nice rally in the markets, right? You're up over 3%. The US dollar doesn't materially weaken, right? It's down sort of like 2% ish. And it's important to keep in mind too that like some of the weakening had already happened, right? For
Yeah.
like the mark and things like that. But so generally, Nixon got like a major thumbs up for this announcement off the bat.
And I think also people have been waiting for the U.S. to do something. And it's not just people, right? Americans have been waiting. The world has been waiting. But the two critical maybe stakeholders that you're highlighting is the American voter is very frustrated with the economic situation. They love that the government is going to go do something about it and that it's bold and that it feels like it's a real solution that I can understand, so to speak. And then the capital markets also think, great, like here's the U.S. actually doing something about a problem that we've been worrying about for a really long time. I'm excited. Let's see how this plays out. And, to some extent, people generally trust everybody who is involved in the policy making. And so they're cheering it on domestically.
So domestically, Nixon got like a major thumbs up from these policies. The foreign reaction was a little different. Did you dig into that at all?
Yeah, the foreign reaction is everybody thinks the sky is falling, and rightly so. I think what's interesting about this is that in stark contrast to what we saw with Bretton Woods in part one, this is a unilateral action. This is not a conference with, multilateral 44 different delegations from all over the world coming together, despite the fact that most of Bretton Woods was actually pre-agreed upon by just the British and the Americans. Nonetheless, it was this construct that tried to bring people into the room and have conversations. In contrast, that the Nixon decision to suspend convertibility and do all these other things, but in particular that, which basically starts the killing of Bretton Woods, was a unilateral decision. And so, the Japanese market opens and it's down like 20%. Famously, the head of the IMF is watching the speech with Connally in his office, and when the speech is over, he just sort of walks out, and he apparently is kind of quite humiliated that he wasn't a part of this decision and that the U.S. did this unilaterally. And European stock markets crash, single digits, but they move downward pretty sharply. There's big drawdowns in Europe, and the Europeans actually decide to close their foreign exchange markets for 2 weeks because they expect that this is going to create a really chaotic situation. Kissinger said this. He said that this was seen by many as a declaration of economic war and a retreat of the United States from its commitment to an open international system. So there's kind of four main concerns as I see them. One, people are worried, like, when is the tariff going to end? When is this surcharge going to go away? Two, when is convertibility going to come back? Like, when can I redeem dollars for gold again? Three, is the U.S. going to raise interest rates to make the dollar more attractive to solve this problem of the dollar outflow? And then four, why does the U.S. expect us to bear the burden of fixing all these problems when some of this maybe not all, but some of this is a domestic issue that the U.S. has not been able to fix. And it isn't necessarily on the allies to fix it for it, right? And so I think that's the general reaction, across the world. Not great.
Yep. And the U.S. reaction,
they're pretty shocked. You might add,
Right.
they're pretty shocked.
The U.S. reaction to the international reaction can best be summed up by what is probably the most famous quote from this entire period, which is, "It's our currency, but it's your problem."
Yeah, from our friend John Connally.
That's right. That's right. You may not have known that, but John Connally is the one who said that.
Yeah.
And so all this at Camp David happens in August. You get sort of a more muted market response than you maybe would have expected. Some of the change had already happened. Some of the currency markets were closed. The U.S. market rallies, global markets tank. But you're sort of in this period where everybody's expecting something like Bretton Woods to come back, right?
Right.
I don't think anybody is really thinking that something like Bretton Woods is gone forever. They're just thinking, let's all get around the table and figure this out. Everybody knows that there's a problem.
Yeah, or even let alone a hard asset underpinning the global monetary order. Nobody's expecting that to go away at this point.
Right. And I don't think the people at Camp David were expecting it to go away.
Right.
They
certainly not Paul Volcker.
Right. So the next major milestone in this path to fiat, right, that we're on, is the Smithsonian Agreement in December of 1971. Right. So you had kind of 5-ish months in between Camp David and the Smithsonian Agreement. And this was, as I understand it, the one and really the only attempt to reestablish something like Bretton Woods, where the dollar was officially devalued by 8% against gold, so $35 per ounce to $38 per ounce, and it was repegged, right? Remember in Bretton Woods we had fixed exchange. The dollar was linked to gold, and then every other currency around the world was linked to the dollar, and so you had these other currencies repegged against the U.S., where the mark was revalued at 13.6%, yen at 16.9%, franc at 8.6%. So like a pretty strong. A pretty big change in currency markets, right? Remember, these are not like small cap stocks, right? These are currency markets. They're supposed to be super stable. So when you get a 10% change, it's a huge deal. And so that was the first attempt to try to reestablish something like Bretton Woods, right? Try to reestablish people generally didn't want volatility in this part of the economy, right? They wanted this part to be stable. Immediately after the Smithsonian Agreement, speculators basically go nuts, right? They start testing all these limits, and by February of 73, right? So a little over a year later, Europe suspends its support for the whole program, and in March of 1973, we basically have a total depeg, a total float across the world, and Bretton Woods is dead. And during that time period, the U.S. dollar lost another sort of 10 to 15% of its value. So in aggregate, from this announcement, the U.S. lost about 20%. U.S. dollar lost about 20% of its value.
Yeah, and it feels like we unceremoniously go into a floating exchange rate system without a formal Bretton Woods style global agreement that is what we're doing intentionally.
Absolutely, yeah. This is almost like a mistake at this point.
Which is the world we're living in today.
Right. And this is the so we inadvertently moved into a fiat currency floating exchange rate world, and we're still in this world today. But one of the main points here is that this is arguably like not what was intended at the Camp David conference.
Although we should say people were arguing for this. There were people, including George Shultz and Milton Friedman and others, who were arguing that this should be the world. We should have a floating exchange rate system that lets the market determine the price of each currency relative to each other, and in that will automatically rebalance depending on what the market thinks. But that was not at all the consensus view. That was not mainstream. That was pretty peripheral at that point.
And I got to think that one of the reasons that a major shift to a new Bretton Woods agreement was never struck was that this interim period, between Camp David and whatever was next, was just a bonanza for Nixon, right?
Yep.
And so 1972 presidential election year, Nixon just annihilates McGovern, right? Like he wins 49 of 50 states. The economy is absolutely humming. It's like everything came together for Nixon in 1972. And he just, in a landslide victory, one of the biggest presidential victories ever, becomes, president for a second term. And so my guess is that that had something to do with why there was never a new system set up. Is it was kind of like maybe like looking around the room, being like, "This is working. Let's just keep doing this."
Yeah. Well, and there's no appetite globally. There's no crisis. Like the Bretton Woods system was built as a result of a world war that was the culmination of the chaos of another world war. And so crisis always begets opportunity for massive restructuring and reconsidering kind of the rules of the game and trying to make the world better and avoid whatever mistakes led to the crisis. And there was not that at this point in the 70s. There was the U.S. had its problems, but generally things were progressing. The key adversary was the Soviet Union, but there was no appetite to integrate them into some sort of global system. Mainly, they didn't want to be integrated, is my understanding. China was opening up, but that was not a major chip that might trigger some sort of crisis. So there was just no appetite. There was no need from any of these players who have all these competing strategies to converge and try to architect a new system, and certainly not from the U.S.
And just to give a sense for how good 72 was for Nixon, right? So GDP went from 3% to 5.25%, 71 to 72. Unemployment falls from 6% to 5%, and inflation goes from 4.4 to 3.4. Right. So this
it's looking great.
Right. So whatever they did, right, it worked temporarily
for now. Yeah.
It's probably one of the greatest ironies that Nixon is going to be, impeached shortly because of how worried he was about winning the presidential election over Watergate. And this is beyond the scope of this study. Here we're studying how the Bretton Woods system failed and why. But this 1972 period of great economic results did not last very long, and things got quite bad for
really bad.
The U.S. Shortly thereafter.
Matt, do you want to dive into a bit of an analysis as to why we were so keen on doing this study right now and why we see a lot of similarities? There are some differences, obviously. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But I do think that there are some really strong similarities that are worth being explicit about and pointing out and maybe thinking through, which are, for example, there, in the early 70s, late 60s, there's a lot of failed war fatigue around Vietnam. And of course, you could look back right now to Afghanistan and the kind of failed war fatigue there that has led to some decisions and some changes. Rising debt, massive amounts of debt building up, inflation, stagflation, which was a key word that sort of comes into the lexicon back then, is a word that has popped up here as of recent as well. The trade deficit, right, is something that starts, like you noted, in 69 through 71. We have record trade deficits. I think 2024 was the biggest trade deficit on record for the U.S. You have other countries complaining about dollarization and that the U.S. is exporting its problems. Again, that kind of rhymes with today. And then, of course, you have tariffs and Middle Eastern flashpoints and populism and this fight between the Fed and the White House, right? Like this Fed antagonism. All of that stuff, if I didn't qualify it, you wouldn't know if I was talking about late 60s, early 70s, or if I was talking about basically the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right? So a lot of similarities that rhyme between that period and what we're living through today.
I think as I learn more and more about Richard Nixon, there's a lot of similarities between him and President Trump.
Sure.
To me, one of the main differences is Nixon was trying to build this new majority in the middle, right? Versus that's not necessarily what President Trump is trying to do. I think if you combine Connally with Nixon, you get someone that looks a lot like Donald Trump.
Yes,
a lot
100%.
like President Trump.
Yeah.
When you mix in that sort of that nationalism and that fighting more for the everyday American type global policy, things like that.
Sort of like win at all costs mentality and their personalities. And then also the fight with the Fed, like all these things definitely feel very President Trump / President Nixon like. You know, they're two characters that have a lot of similarities in terms of how they've approached their presidencies.
And I think one theme we're seeing just across these time periods, and it's happening today as well, is, you know, what these global policymakers say in public and in speeches and whatnot. Like we started out with Connally's 4 no's, right? That was not that far before, you know, Camp David. And we saw something similar in the GFC, right? We saw, when we studied the GFC, we saw, you know, the leaders kind of saying like the mortgage problem's not that bad, it's fine.
Right.
I think that they actually didn't know, to be honest, at that point. That was not dishonesty or anything. But that's like one major takeaway from all of this too. And I think just the mixing of economics and politics to the point that there's not really any daylight in between these things, right?
Yeah,
like
totally.
They're so intertwined with each other.
Right. Yeah, I guess
the
main difference is not to just leave it as it almost like a mirror image of each other. The main differences are we already mentioned the idea of floating rates, right? Like at that time, we were in a fixed exchange rate regime. Now we have been in a floating exchange rate regime for a long time. The U.S. at the time was a net importer of oil. We're a net exporter of oil now, so that feels very different. And the foreign exchange market is way bigger now than it was back then. I mean, we're talking billions versus trillions now. And so those things make it a bit different. Of course, you could also point out the fact that the news cycle back then was very different than it is now. Now we basically have these social media platforms and instant communications, whereas then you still had a day or two worth of media cycle for anything, and it was all TV based. Of course, there was no internet, right? So a bit of a different environment in terms of information flow. All right, Matt, shall we leave it there?
Absolutely. This was fun. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, the best way to help us is to share it with anyone you think might like it, and to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And of course, be on the lookout for our next series dropping over the next month or so. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.